Welcome to Time of Death. This video is for informational purposes and in no way meant to glorify or condone violence. In today's video, we'll be discussing the murder of baby girl Reeves. Baby Reeves was killed on Thursday, February 23, 2017 in the 1300 block of West 77th Street in Vermont Knolls, according to LA County Coroner records. Johnny Lee Washington, Anissa Hughes, and Jarrett Grace were subsequently arrested and charged with the murder. The following is the evidence at trial. Defendant Washington and Ms. Miller started hooking up in November of 2016. Defendant Washington was dating Defendant Hughes at the time. Although Defendant Washington dated many women, Defendant Hughes was his main girlfriend. Ms. Miller and Defendant Hughes ran into each other one night in December of 2016. Defendant Hughes threw a drink at Ms. Miller and challenged her to a fight. Ms. Miller agreed, and they fought at a nearby high school. Ms. Miller got the better of the fight. Later that night, Defendant Hughes intentionally drove her car into Ms. Miller's car, ramming it 3 times. After the fight, Defendant Hughes posted messages on social media saying she had been pregnant, but Ms. Miller caused her to miscarry by kicking her in the stomach. Defendant Hughes repeatedly called Ms. Miller and sent her messages challenging her to another fight. In one exchange at the end of December of 2016, Defendant Hughes told Ms. Miller to drop a location for a fight. Ms. Miller replied, "You just mad I beat the baby out of you. Now bye, bitch. Be mad at that." On January 29, 2017, Ms. Miller drove to St. Andrews Park. She stopped her car in the parking lot and started talking to some people, including Defendant Grace. Defendant Grace and Defendant Washington were friends and members of the A-Tray Gangsters. At some point, Ms. Miller saw Defendant Hughes driving to the parking lot. Defendant Hughes stopped her car, and Defendant Washington got out of the passenger side door. Ms. Miller immediately left the park and started driving home because she didn't want any problems. On her way home, Ms. Miller noticed Defendant Hughes driving behind her very closely. Defendant Hughes followed Ms. Miller for about a mile. Hughes then pulled her car to the side of Ms. Miller's car, rolled down her window, and fired 3 or 4 gunshots in Miller's direction. One of the bullets grazed Ms. Miller's leg. Hughes drove away without saying anything. Ms. Reeves met Defendant Washington when she was 16 years old, and they started having sex off and on. Around August of 2016, Ms. Reeves confronted Defendant Hughes about hooking up with Defendant Washington behind her back. About a month later, Ms. Reeves discovered she was pregnant with Defendant Washington's child, and she immediately shared the news with Defendant Hughes. Around December 30th, 2016, Defendant Hughes posted a message on social media saying, "The last bitch I just fought made me lose my baby, and see where Reeves at, cause she next." Ms. Reeves interpreted this message to be a threat to her unborn child. In late January of 2017, Defendant Washington told someone Reeves a goner. Around the same time, Defendant Hughes said she was trying to catch Reeves. At some point, Defendant Washington sent Ms. Reeves a message saying, "You heard what happened to Miller. 100K, don't let me catch you." Around this time, Defendant Grace started sending Ms. Reeves messages claiming he wanted to have a romantic relationship with her. Ms. Reeves had previously met Defendant Grace through Defendant Washington, and they were friendly with each other. Ms. Reeves, however, thought it was weird that Defendant Grace was contacting her, as he knew she was on bad terms with Defendant Washington. Defendant Grace asked Ms. Reeves for her address and said she could trust him. At the time, Ms. Reeves was living in San Bernardino. She gave Defendant Grace a fake address. After exchanging messages with Defendant Grace for several weeks, Ms. Reeves finally agreed to meet him in person early in the morning on February 23, 2017. Defendant Grace reassured her she was safe with him and would not let Defendant Washington or Defendant Hughes touch her. Ms. Reeves was 7 months pregnant at the time. Ms. Reeves' friend agreed to drive her from San Bernardino to Los Angeles. At 12:31 a.m., Defendant Grace sent Ms. Reeves a message asking where she was. Ms. Reeves replied she was on her way and would tell him when she was outside. Defendant Grace asked which direction she was coming from, and Ms. Reeves responded down Fig. When Defendant Grace sent the messages, phone records show he, Defendant Washington, and Defendant Hughes were all in the same area near Defendant Washington's house. A few minutes later, Ms. Reeves' friend dropped her off a short distance from 77th and Raymond, which is where Defendant Grace told her to meet him. Ms. Reeves saw Defendant Grace waiting and started walking toward him. As she approached, Defendant Grace said A-Tray Gangsters, and a car rolled up from the opposite direction. Ms. Reeves gave varying accounts of what happened next. Initially, she told detectives that Defendant Hughes was driving the car and Defendant Washington was the passenger. Defendant Hughes got out of the car, and Ms. Reeves started talking shit, trying to instigate a fight. Defendant Hughes went back to the car and grabbed the gun. She shot Ms. Reeves in her stomach and passed the gun to Defendant Washington, who shot Ms. Reeves in her back and mouth. Ms. Reeves suffered serious injuries but survived. Doctors delivered Ms. Reeves' fetus by emergency C-section, but the fetus was already dead. The fetus didn't suffer any trauma, and the coroner opined the fetus died because of the gunshot wounds to Ms. Reeves. Police executed a search warrant at Defendant Washington's apartment, and they discovered a black SUV parked in the rear of the complex. Inside the SUV, police found Defendant Washington's ID card, debit card, and Medi-Cal card. Defendant Hughes' fingerprints were on the passenger side visor mirror. There was an irregularly shaped bloodstain in the back seat, which contained Ms. Reeves' DNA. The police arrested Defendant Grace about a month after the shooting, and they put him in a jail cell with an undercover Perkins agent. Defendant Grace implied to the agent that Defendant Washington and Defendant Hughes shot Ms. Reeves in the stomach. Defendant Grace also told the agent he put the whole play in motion. Following the trial, the jury convicted defendants Johnny Lee Washington, Anissa Hughes, and Jarrett Grace of numerous crimes, including first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and assault with a firearm. The court sentenced Defendant Washington to an aggregate term of 21 years and 8 months plus 150 years to life. It sentenced Defendant Hughes to an aggregate term of 20 years plus 107 years to life. It sentenced Defendant Grace to an aggregate term of 75 years to life. Baby girl Reeves was in utero at the time of death.